So the project I've been working on recently is a built-in, and this is a fireside built-in, so it's actually going to be two built-ins, but I've stacked these one on top of the other, and there'll be bookcases on top of these, but I stacked these one on top of the other in my shop just so I could attach all the doors and save space. So the design for these doors are overlaid doors, and I don't have a video up on my channel of overlaid doors, so I figured I would kind of make a separate video showing briefly how I made these doors, because I also have a video up there of door making, but mostly to show how I went about planning the hinges and how to install those hinges. So this is a quick little segment showing how I made the doors for this cabinet, and if you want a more comprehensive guide to making these types of doors, I have a video on my channel. I basically ripped down lumber right from the hardware store because it's flat and even enough that you don't have to plane it down for these style doors. And then I cut my stiles and my rails, and I cut my rails to rough length and then run it over my table saw a little off center to cut that center groove for the panel. Once that's all done, I could put a stop on my fence and put a dado stack in my table saw and cut all the tongues that will fit into those grooves. And then I ended up making two size doors for this project, so I made that one set of doors first and then subtracted 1/8 of an inch from those rails, cut new rails, and then made this second set of doors. I used 1/4 inch birch veneer ply for the inserts of the doors, and that was simply a matter of just cutting it all down on my table saw and then fitting it into each door. Obviously there's going to be two sizes of that as well, and then gluing it up by attaching adding glue just to the tongues of these pieces so that panel can float in the middle of the door. And then I had custom sized doors to fit the built-in. So the first considerations before going and buying hinges is deciding what kind of frame you either want to build or what kind of frame you have if you are replacing hinges. So these hinges are called European concealed hinges because they are developed in Europe, and in Europe the carcass usually don't have thick overlapping frames on them. In countries where they employ using face frames more, they've developed these hinges to attach directly to your face frame. On this one I technically have a face frame around the whole cabinet, it's just my center median is the same thickness as my carcass. So the face frame hinges are going to look similar to this. This one is one piece, it doesn't come apart, but they do sell these where this will come apart. And this is also a soft close style hinge. Basically these little teeth are just going to latch onto the inside of that face frame, and that's how that is going to mount with obviously your door on the front. For the frameless cabinets, your hinge is going to look a little bit different, and these come with a detachable mounting plate, which make moving these around if you're installing them easier, and those mount just on the inside of the wall. Now there are a couple different style hinges you can buy for overlay cabinets. One is going to be half overlay, which is what these hinges are, and those are different than regular overlay where this hinge is going to be a flat piece. This one has a little bump out in it called a crank, and that crank makes it so that this door is offset a little bit, and you could put two on either side and have an even reveal down the middle of this median. So half overlay hinges, not to be confused with 1/2 inch overlay hinges, are what you use when you have two cabinet doors next to each other. If you put 1/2 inch overlay hinges here or full overlay hinges here, your cabinet doors will not open. They'll hit each other when you try and open them. And you could see the cabinets that I left still mounted have that even reveal, and they could be opened simultaneously. So then on the far side of this cabinet, I have my stile, and this is going to be a detachable stile so that I could scribe it to the wall of the customer's house. But these face frame style hinges are going to attach with a single screw on the inside edge of those face frames. Now these are 1/2 inch overlay hinges, and I marked a 1/2 inch on the side of my cabinet, so that means that this hinge is going to overlay the stile a 1/2 inch. A full overlay hinge would, since this style is I think 1 inch and 1/8 wide, would come about 3/4 of an inch over. So that's how you decide how much of an overlay you need, is by measuring the inside of that face frame over, and then that's where your door is going to be. You can see when I prop this door up on the inside of that frame that it comes right to that line. Now I had some spare hinges laying around, and this is also a face frame style hinge, but the overlay is for 1.25 inches. So you can see when you prop that piece up on the inside of that cabinet how much further that 1.25 inch overlay will stick out past this face frame. So the decision to go with the 1/2 inch overlay hinge on this edge over here was mainly because there is going to be a wall right here, and you don't want that cabinet to stick out past this face frame and hit that wall first off, but also you want a little bit of room here in order to open that cabinet and so it doesn't hit the wall. The other consideration when making these doors was how much they were going to overlay the top and the bottom of my rails. Now that measurement is really up to you, and it does not affect the style hinges you pick out whatsoever. I was working off a photo which had about an equal distance cover on the overlay on the rails, and these are going to be sitting close to the floor, so molding is going to be coming up fairly close to the bottom side of this rail, so I didn't want the doors to hang down too much. So I basically just picked an equal distance on these rails and marked it on my cabinet. Now if you're going to be making doors for your cabinets like I did, obviously you have to figure out if you're going to be using frameless or frame style hinges, and then also the overlay that you need for all of your hinges. So I knew on the edges I'd be using that 1/2 inch overlay, and I marked on the edge that 1/2 inch. I knew in the center I'd be using 1/2 overlay hinges, and I marked center on my partition in the middle. When I had those marks, I could then mark center of my opening, and from center to the marks on either side was going to be the width of all of my doors. Now, if you are making these all similar with similar size styles, all of your widths should be the same. But since I was using 1/2 overlay in the middle and 1/2 inch overlay on the edges, that meant that these doors are 1/8 of an inch skinnier than my edge doors because the overlay isn't as long. So these middle doors ended up being 17 3/4 inches, whereas the doors on all my edges were 17 7/8. But once I had that measurement, I knew my centers on both cabinets were going to be 17 3/4 and my edges 17 7/8. And it's really easy if you're making multiple doors to just make 2 sets. So the first time I had to make these doors, I went to the store and I bought one of these jigs that shows you where to drill the hole for the cup of that hinge. It came in a set with the exact right size Forstner bit. This is an 1 3/8 bit. I didn't even check the directions to see if this works. Most of these hinges, these are all Blum hinges, and the ones I used before were Blum, and they seem fairly universal because they worked out fine for this one. So they recommend of your height, you should put the distance down from the top and the bottom at about 1/5 or 1/6 of your height. Now these doors are a little over 15 inches, which means 1/5 of that height is 3-inch segments. So I'm going to mark down 3 inches on either side of my stile. I can then take my jig, put it up against the edge of my cabinet door, and mark these 3 holes, making sure that that center line, there's little raised ridges on this that show you where that center line goes, lining that center line up on the door with the jig. Then it's a simple matter of mounting this in a drill press. You could freehand these, but I just find that they're much more accurate in a drill press, and you're going to be drilling until the top of this bit is flush with the top of your lumber. So with that hole drilled, it's simply a matter of putting that cup in there, lining it up with the marks you made for the 2 holes, and then screwing it down. Now at this point you can check and make sure that this is flush with the top of your piece of wood. Make sure you drilled it deep enough, because you don't want these proud of that lumber. The directions that come with your hinge are going to tell you how far you mount that mounting bracket back from your face frame or the front of your cabinet, whatever you have. So I usually keep a metric tape measure around, because a lot of the times these instructions are in metric measurements, and it just makes it easier than having to convert it. So with that measurement, I set a stop on my angle, and I could go up and down my face frame and mark a line. So with the height of my doors, I knew my reveal on top and bottom is about 15/16. It's a little bit more of a reveal on the top than the bottom, just to give some visual space between the molding and the bottom of the door. So from that 15/16, I measured down from the top of my door 15/16. I still had that center line from when I drilled my hole, and I saw that it was 1 inch and 15/16, which means I could go on the inside of my door, measure down 1 inch and 15/16, and that would be the center line for my mounting brackets. So down 1 inch and 15/16, up 1 inch and 15/16. Now once you have that mark, you can line up your mounting plate. These holes should run over the center of that line, and then there's a little point at the end of this mounting bracket, and that should go over your front line, and then you could put marks on there. So the process for drilling and attaching all of these cups is going to be the same on all the doors. But obviously now I'm doing the 1/2 inch overlay for the outside of my cabinet. Now to mount these, I could use that exact same 1 inch and 15/16 from the top and the bottom of my rails, because I drilled these at the 3 inches down, just like I did the other hinges. Now these are a little different because they don't come apart. Once I have that mark, I could place my cabinet on there and then mark where that screw hole is going to go. Now on these hinges, unlike the other ones I have, which makes them nicer, is they give you an oval hole in the center there, so that you could slide these up and down instead of just having one hole, so they don't have to be as accurate as the other hinges. So to attach these, you basically have that one big screw and that sliding oval on the top and the bottom. So what I like to do is on my face frame, I make a mark where the top of that door should be. And then before I completely tighten those screws down, I could raise or lower the door to line it up with that mark. So you could see the nice thing about these hinges and these doors are, while sometimes the math takes a little bit of time and figuring out what hinge you need takes a while, all those measurements paid off because I haven't made any adjustments on the hinges because these are adjustable hinges, and already they're fairly lined up and my reveal's pretty good. So once I have the other two doors in place, I can go through and get all these set up and attach the hardware. Now, one of the last big considerations when choosing all of these things that go into what style doors and hinges you're going to use are going to be this gap right here. This gap right here is created when you use a face frame style hinge. And it's just because the engineering of that hinge is different than the ones with the arms and the kinks in them. For this door to open without the edge of the door hitting your face frame, you need that gap. Now the first time you, in fact mine are actually set where it's almost kind of scraping the inside of that face frame. Now the first time you mount these doors, this gap is going to look huge and then you're going to think it's a mistake, but it's really not. It's also in place because I'm going to be installing rubber pads on all these doors, which means they're going to stick out on the edge here as well, and that gap will look more even once that pad's in place. Now some of the adjustments on these hinges will make this gap as small as possible, but in general it's going to be there. Now on most situations when you're using these sorts of hinges, in my situation, the wall is going to be right here. So no one is ever going to see this gap. If you're standing on top of the cabinet looking at the bookcases above it, you might see this one a little bit, but like I said, it's going to be evened out by that rubber bumper. Also, if you're making cabinetry and these are on upper cabinets, unless you bend down and stare at the underside of the cabinet, you will not see it. And if they're on cabinets that are on the floor and you have a countertop counterleaving and even drawers on top of cabinets, you're never going to see this gap. It's really only if you're mounting a singular cabinet in the center of a room where you can walk around it that this might be a reason why you wouldn't use these face frame style hinges. So now that I have these mounted, I can mount these other two doors the exact same way. The only change you have to make is on this middle panel, you have to adjust the heights of where you drill the holes for your cups. And that's because if I mount these at the exact same 3 inches as the other side, your screws are going to hit the screws on the other side. So you just shift it down about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch and then adjust all your measurements by that same amount and then mount your doors. So the other really nice thing about these hinges is they're going to have multiple adjustments you can make. So obviously, like I said before, this screw in the center, if you loosen this one and the one on the top, you could slide the door up and down in order to get a good reveal all around. This one on the back is going to adjust your door in and out, and if you screw it, you could see how that gap on the bottom will get bigger or smaller in order to adjust your doors. And then as well as this one in the front here is going to adjust your doors side to side. So if it's hung crookedly, you could twist this one on bottom or the one on top to adjust that as well. Now on the other side, there's not as much room for adjustment. These holes for those doors are actually circular holes, so you can't move this one up and down. But it does have this one in the back. If you loosen this one and the one on top, you could push the door in and out. And then this one in the corner here, which is kind of hard to see, pushes the door front and backwards.